The golden age of Tinseltown was a meticulously crafted machine designed to transform mere mortals into literal deities, projecting an illusion of eternal youth that captivated the entire globe. They appeared flawless, immortal, and completely beyond the reach of normal human struggles. However, the brutal truth is that time is a predator that does not care about your box office numbers or your star power. The reality is far darker. Sometimes the intense glare of the spotlight actually accelerates the biological clock, causing stars to decay in ways that leave even their most die-hard worshippers absolutely reeling in shock. In today's exclusive feature, we are ripping away the velvet curtain to expose 11 legendary icons whose appearances in their final years were shockingly different from their prime glory days. We are talking about rapid, horrifying acceleration celebrities who seem to age 20 years in a blink, and others who destroyed their own faces in desperate failed attempts to claw back their fleeing youth. And you need to brace yourself for number 7. The metamorphosis is so gut-wrenching and extreme that witnesses reportedly could not believe they were looking at the same human being. These were not your standard cases of getting old gracefully. These are tragic cautionary tales etched deeply into skin that was once considered the perfection of beauty. You have memorized their masterpieces. You have idolized their immense talent and their stunning physical allure. But what really happens when the director yells "cut" for the last time and the cruel, unforgiving march of nature takes control? What terrible price did these legends pay for spending their lives in the public eye? Furthermore, could their harrowing downfalls actually hold the key to understanding our own terrifying relationship with mortality and the aging process? Let's dive deep into the shadows and uncover the startling reality of Hollywood's fallen angels in their twilight years. Clip removed to focus on narrative flow. The contrast is blindingly painful. Number 1, Mickey Rooney. A heartbreaking slide from the ultimate boy wonder to a weathered, broken veteran. Mickey Rooney launched his career as the absolute symbol of the American teenager, the face of a generation. With those sparkling eyes, that bottomless well of energy and undeniable boyish charisma, he was the living, breathing definition of youthful joy for millions of moviegoers. Blockbusters like Boys Town and the Andy Hardy franchise didn't just make him famous, they made him the single biggest box office attraction in the world by the early 1940s. He was raking in $150,000 per picture, an absolute fortune in those days, but underneath that wholesome, cheerful mask, Rooney was living a life of dangerous excess. The general public had no idea that behind the innocent character roles, Mickey was burning the candle at both ends with a ferocity that would kill an ordinary man. While the world saw the clean-cut kid next door, Hollywood insiders were watching him spiral, witnessing his insatiable appetite for hard liquor, high-stakes gambling, and a revolving door of women. It was a toxic lifestyle, and it did not take long for those severe indulgences to come back and collect a heavy debt. By the time he reached his early 50s, an age where many leading men are just entering their distinguished prime, Mickey Rooney looked like he had aged decades beyond his actual years. His face, once the definition of animation and youth, had become swollen, doughy, and saggier than seemed possible. The famous mischievous sparkle in his eyes had been extinguished, replaced by the heavy, deadened stare of a soul who had seen too much darkness way too soon. So what exactly went wrong? Well, enduring 8 disastrous marriages certainly played a massive role in his rapid decline. Every single divorce drained him not just of his financial assets, but of his emotional vitality. His crippling gambling addiction led him to bankruptcy multiple times, adding layers of stress to his face. But the true villain in this tragedy was the relentless, crushing pressure of trying to maintain superstar status long after his boyish appeal had evaporated into thin air. There was one particularly gut-wrenching television appearance in the 1970s where the studio audience audibly gasped when Rooney stepped out from behind the curtain. The man who had been the poster child for American youth now looked old enough to be his own grandfather. His skin hung loosely off his bones, etched with deep, premature canyons of wrinkles. His body, once athletic and spry, had grown soft, round and defeated. It is the cruelest irony of show business. Although Mickey Rooney would survive to the ripe old age of 93, he tragically spent more than half of his life looking significantly older than he actually was. He went from teenage heartthrob to a grizzled, weary old man in record time. Number 2, Betty Hutton, the explosive blonde bombshell who simply vanished into the ether. Back in the 1940s, Betty Hutton dominated the silver screen with an incandescent manic energy that very few performers could ever hope to replicate. Hailed as the blonde bombshell, her iconic turns in classics like The Miracle of Morgan's Creek and Annie Get Your Gun highlighted a rare mix of slapstick comedy, powerful vocals and athletic dance. Her face was the gold standard of wholesome all-American radiance. She possessed flawless features, a $1 million grin that could light up a room, and expressive eyes capable of flipping from pure ecstasy to shattering heartbreak in a split second. However, the very same manic intensity that catapulted Betty to stardom would eventually become the fuel for her catastrophic downfall. When the cameras weren't rolling, she was fighting a secret war against severe depression and a deepening addiction to prescription pills. The suffocating pressure to keep up her high-energy persona pushed her right to the edge of sanity. As the 1950s drew to a close, Betty's star power began to dim rapidly, and tragically, her legendary looks faded right along with it. A relentless series of personal disasters, including failed marriages, career dead ends, and crushing financial ruin, took a devastating physical toll on her appearance. But the true horror story revealed itself in the 1970s after she had largely retreated from the public gaze for years. When Betty finally resurfaced decades later, even her most devoted fan base struggled to believe it was really her. Multiple severe nervous breakdowns had carved visible permanent scars onto a face that was once the definition of radiant health. To make matters worse, a series of botched cosmetic procedures, desperate clawing attempts to reclaim the youth she had lost, had backfired, actually speeding up the aging process grotesquely. Her facial features, once so perfectly balanced, now appeared distorted, swollen, and unnaturally shifted. In a rare, heartbreaking television interview from 1974, the harsh, unforgiving studio lighting exposed the tragic reality of a fallen star. The difference between the exhausted woman sitting there and the glowing icon from 20 years ago was downright jarring. Her complexion looked dangerously fragile, pulled so tight it resembled parchment. Her gaze, which used to hold so much emotion, was locked in a permanent state of shock. The catastrophic aftermath of going under the knife one too many times. But the truly heartbreaking part wasn't just the physical change, it was that Betty knew exactly what had happened to her. She admitted in a late-life sit-down that she avoided reflections entirely. "I don't recognise the stranger staring back at me," she said. "It isn't the legend the public adored, and it certainly isn't the woman I want to recall." She didn't just get older, she vanished completely behind a surgical disguise. "I have feeling right down to my fingerprints. Those hands turned me into Paris's premier safecracker and a maestro of the pickpocket arts." Number 3. Peter Lorre, a tragic figure who eventually withered away until he was little more than a ghost of his former self. You could never accuse Lorre of fitting the cookie-cutter mould of a handsome Hollywood leading man. With his moon-shaped face and those iconic protruding eyes, he built a legendary career, terrifying audiences in masterpieces like M and Casablanca. Yeah, if you look at his early work, there was a magnetic pull to him, a raw intensity that commanded the screen despite his short height. However, as the decades rolled on, those unique features didn't just age, they warped into something genuinely unsettling. It was a lethal cocktail of chronic illness, a severe morphine dependency following a spinal injury, and heavy alcoholism that hit the fast-forward button on his physical decline. By the time the 1960s arrived, Lorre had practically evaporated, becoming a literal shell of the man he used to be. That distinctively round face had imploded, leaving behind gaunt cheeks and cavernous shadows beneath his eyes that gave him a skull-like appearance. His skin, once just naturally pale, turned a sickly ash-grey colour that signalled serious internal distress. And those trademark eyes, they seemed to pop out of his wasting skull even more violently, freezing him in an expression of eternal terror. Toward the end, the makeup department wasn't trying to make him look scary. They were desperately trying to make him look like he was still among the living. The decay was so total that when horror legend Vincent Price saw Laurie in his casket in 1964, he couldn't hold back a grim comment. He famously noted that his old friend actually looked significantly better in death than he had while he was still breathing. That wasn't a mean-spirited jab, it was a heartbreaking testament to the sheer agony that had been carved into Peter Lorre's features during his final days. Time didn't just pass for him. It ravaged him, dragging him into the darkness inch by painful inch. Number 4. Gloria Graham, a cautionary tale of stunning beauty obliterated by insecurity. She owned one of the most unforgettable faces in 1950s film noir. With that signature pout and a look that could kill, she was the ultimate femme fatale in heavy hitters like The Big Heat and In a Lonely Place. That specific look didn't just earn her a legion of admirers, it won her an Academy Award for her role in The Bad and the Beautiful. Sadly, Graham fought a private war with her mirror, obsessing over her upper lip, which she believed was far too thin for the camera. That tiny perceived flaw would spiral into one of the most devastating cosmetic catastrophes in Tinseltown history. Starting in the mid-50s, she began chasing a fuller look, subjecting herself to procedure after procedure. She didn't stick to safe techniques either. Rumours flew that she started shoving cotton balls or tissue under her lip just to get that extra volume. Eventually, she escalated to surgery, instructing doctors to graft fat from her body and inject it directly into her mouth. The outcome was nothing short of a nightmare. By the 1960s, that sexy pout had mutated into a permanently bloated, rigid shape that warped her whole visage. The surgeries left her with unmissable scar tissue and a lopsided grin that even the thickest layer of foundation couldn't mask. Even worse, the trauma to the nerves caused partial paralysis, killing the expressiveness that made her a star. In her later movies, cinematographers had to hide her in the dark or use extreme angles just to cover up the wreckage. But face to face, without the benefit of studio lighting, the change was absolutely horrified to witness. It was so severe that Nicholas Ray, her ex-husband and a legendary director, reportedly walked right past her years later, having no idea who she was. Here is the cruelest twist of irony film scholars today worship Graham's original face as perfection. Her frantic mission to correct a non-existent problem ended up destroying the very asset that put her on the map. The knife was meant to save her career, but instead it effectively ended it. That is an error that gets fixed. Number 5. Orson Welles, the prodigy, who grew massive in every sense of the word. Back in his prime, Welles was an absolute force of nature. He was tall, strikingly handsome, and possessed a booming baritone voice that mesmerised anyone within earshot. When he unleashed Citizen Kane on the world at only 25, he wasn't just proving his brilliance behind the camera. He was also a legitimate heartthrob, a leading man with a magnetic intensity that couldn't be ignored. But as the calendar pages turned, Wells's physicality shifted in one of the most drastic alterations ever seen in show business history. The slender, sharp-suited panic inducer behind the War of the Worlds broadcast ballooned into a figure of Shakespearean immensity. By the time the 1970s rolled around, the legendary director had ballooned to more than twice his original body mass. That legendary sculpturesque mug that once defined Hollywood handsome didn't just fade away. It was practically swallowed whole by a face that seemed to be expanding in real time. Those piercing eyes, which could once cut through glass, were now barely visible, peeking out from deep within heavy swollen lids like a prisoner looking through a cell window. And that jawline, the one that could have sliced a steak, it vanished completely buried under layers of excess flesh until his neck and chin were indistinguishable from one another. Even that booming godlike baritone of his, though it still carried a certain majesty, started to sound painful, rattled by the heavy wheezing breaths of a man fighting for every gasp of air. Welles was sharply aware that he was transforming into a caricature of his former self. He used humour as a shield, constantly cracking self-deprecating jokes about his massive girth before the tabloids could do it for him. He once famously quipped, "My doctor told me to stop having intimate dinners for 4 unless there are actually 3 other people sitting at the table." But let's be real, behind the witty one-liners lay a terrifying reality of spiralling health crises and a career that was taking a serious hit because of his inability to move. The massive weight gain wasn't a solo act, it was partnering with decades of chain-smoking cigars, drinking enough brandy to float a battleship, and ignoring every chronic health warning sign, all of which aged the genius director at warp speed. By the time he hit his 60s, he wasn't walking, he was lumbering with the painful, heavy gait of a man pushing 90 every step, a monumental effort against gravity. His complexion turned a ghostly waxen grey, a sickly pallor that screamed of internal failure, and he'd be completely wiped out, panting and sweating after the slightest physical movement. As the physical decline accelerated, Wells had to get creative to keep the illusion alive. He started dressing like a magician, trying to hide a tank, draping himself in gigantic flowing black capes and tent-like outfits designed to mask the true extent of his size. When it came to TV gigs, he became the master of angles, demanding to sit behind massive desks or insisting the camera only shoot him from the chest up to crop out the rest of the mountain. He grew a thick beard, not just for style, but as a strategic camouflage to cover his multiple chins. Towards the end, he was even slapping on heavy stage makeup just to go to the grocery store, trying to paint some life back into his greying skin. But the most heartbreaking proof of his decline came when Wells finally passed away in 1985 at the age of 70. While the obituaries noted that 70 was a relatively young age to go, nobody was shocked. The public reaction was essentially, wait, he was only 70. If you look at the photos from his last few years, the man looks absolutely ancient. Most fans assumed he was pushing 85 or 90, not barely scraping into his 7th decade. Just completely tragic, inconsequential facts that paint a picture of a genius consumed by his own appetites. Number 6, the indomitable Bette Davis. Even as the lights went out, those eyes kept watching the world fade away. And honestly, she had the most incredible pair of eyes in the history of cinema. That is the one thing every critic, fan and hater always said about Bette Davis, those eyes. And for once, the hype was 100% accurate. During her absolute prime, those massive, intense orbs dominated the screen, telegraphing everything from smouldering, dangerous passion to the kind of murderous rage that could burn a house down without a match. When you paired that gaze with her clipped, unique vocal delivery and her refusal to play nice Davis, built a screen legacy that snagged her 2 Academy Awards and cemented her status as a bona fide Hollywood deity. But let's be clear, Father Time didn't just touch Bette Davis. He beat her down. The aging process was exceptionally cruel to her. It systematically dismantled her, turning a woman who was once a terrifying force of nature into a heartbreakingly frail, ghost-like figure. The slide really started with her legendary smoking habit. We're talking chain smoking up to 4 packs a day. That level of nicotine addiction etched deep canyon-like crevices around her mouth and eyes, locking her face into a permanent mask of severity. Then came the strokes, hitting her one after another in the late 1970s and early 80s, like a boxer working a speed bag. The first major one in 1983 was a devastating blow, partially paralysing the side of her face and slurring that crisp, razor-sharp diction that had been her trademark for 50 years. When she made the rounds on the talk show circuit in those final years, the audience audibly gasped. The shock factor was high. Her face, once full of life and fire, had wasted away to a gaunt skull, with skin so paper-thin and translucent it looked like it might tear if she smiled too hard, stretched tight over protruding bones. Her famous posture, that straight-backed, defiant stance, had crumbled into a permanent, painful stoop. Even her hands, which used to punctuate her acting with such grace, were now twisted, gnarled, and constantly trembling. But the thing that really freaked people out was the weight loss. She had practically evaporated. By the time she shot her final movie, The Whales of August, in 1987, Davis looked almost spectral, like a fragile shadow that might blow away in a stiff breeze. The costume designers had a nightmare of a time because clothes just hung off her skeleton. There wasn't enough body left to hold the fabric up. The director, Lindsay Anderson, later spilled the tea on how difficult the shoot was, noting they had to do take after take because Bette physically didn't have the energy to walk across a room or lift a teacup consistently. And yet, through all that physical devastation, those legendary eyes refused to dim. They remained piercing, hyper-intelligent, and unmistakably Bette. In fact, they looked even bigger and more terrifying set against her wasting face, creating a spooky, intense contrast that was hard to look away from. It was the vibrant, ferocious spirit of a Hollywood legend, staring out from the wreckage of a body that had fought and lost too many wars. Her body gave up, but those eyes were ready to fight until the final second. Let the legends lie, but never forget the truth. Number 7, the goddess Rita Hayworth. This is the unbelievable tragedy that practically nobody understood until it was too late. Back in the 1940s, calling Rita Hayworth famous was an insult. She was a global icon. Her performance in Gilda is seared into the collective consciousness, specifically that moment she flips that glorious red hair back. It didn't just capture an audience, it enslaved the entire world. During the chaos of World War II, her pin-up shot was plastered on more barracks' walls, locker doors, and deadly torpedoes than any other woman on the planet. She was the face of the era. Her beauty was something else entirely. It felt supernatural, like she wasn't actually made of the same flesh and blood as the rest of us. She had perfectly symmetrical features, skin that glowed like it was lit from within, and a smile that managed to be totally innocent and devastatingly seductive at the exact same time. But Rita Hayworth's final act revealed a horror story so profound it fundamentally shifted how Hollywood and the general public looked at aging and brain disease. The cracks in the facade started showing way back in the 1960s, which was shocking because Hayworth was still only in her 40s, prime time for an actress of her caliber. She had always been known as a quick study, able to memorize pages of dialogue and intricate dance steps in a heartbeat, but suddenly she couldn't remember a thing. Directors were getting frustrated, noticing she looked completely lost on set, dazed and confused, needing a dozen takes just to get through a simple sentence or movement. The entire industry and even Rita herself wrote it off as a drinking problem. She had been hitting the bottle, sure, so everyone assumed she was just another washed-up drunk. But alcohol was just the scapegoat for a much darker culprit. Fast forward to the early 1970s and the physical transformation of the screen siren was nothing short of shocking. The change was absolute and undeniable. That legendary grace, the way she used to glide across the screen with the fluidity of water, was gone, replaced by a heartbreaking shuffle and a clumsy, hesitant stumble. Her iconic visage, which once lit up the cinema with wit and vivacity, had fallen into a permanent state of bewilderment. With glazed-over eyes and a slack jaw, her weight yo-yoed wildly, and she often appeared completely lost in public, staring blankly at old friends she no longer recognised. However, the true tragedy culminated in a gut-wrenching incident during a production in 1976 that left the entire industry whispering in horror. On a set packed with colleagues she had worked with for decades, Rita was helpless, repeatedly flubbing her lines and looking around with the frightened eyes of a stranger in a room full of ghosts. The situation deteriorated so rapidly that the producers had no choice but to pull the plug, abandoning the project entirely to save her from further public humiliation. Insiders on the crew later spilled the beans, describing the harrowing sight of the world's former beauty queen standing solitary in her dressing room, staring into a mirror and failing to identify the woman looking back at her. The tabloids called it drunkenness, but the terrifying truth, which even Rita couldn't grasp, was that she was in the clutches of Alzheimer's disease long before the medical community or the public truly understood the horror of the condition. Tragically, she wouldn't receive an official diagnosis until 1980, leaving her in a purgatory of confusion for years without answers. This revelation turned Hayworth into the very first global superstar to become the public face of this memory-thieving plague, changing the conversation around the illness forever. When she did brave the cameras in those final years, the images sent shockwaves through the fandom. People simply could not believe their eyes. The goddess was gone, replaced by a dishevelled, bloated figure with haunted, empty eyes that seemed to be endlessly scanning the horizon for a memory that was just out of reach. Those flawless features that had defined an era were now slack, locked in a rigid, mask-like stare that conveyed absolutely nothing but emptiness. Even her crowning glory, those fiery red tresses that had been her trademark, hung greasy and limp, a stark indicator that she had lost the ability to perform even the most basic self-care routines. The disparity between the radiant bombshell of CoverGirl and this fragile, befuddled old woman was so jarring that conspiracy theories popped up, with fans insisting the paparazzi photos must be doctored fakes. Sadly, there was no trickery involved. This was the brutal, unvarnished reality of a disease that was methodically erasing Rita's mind while leaving her physical shell behind. When she finally passed away in 1987, the sad truth was that Rita Hayworth had already been gone for nearly 20 years, trapped in a slow, agonising fade. She died oblivious to her own icon status, unable to name her closest family members, and completely severed from the dazzling woman she used to be. It was a decline so precipitous and awful that the public desperately wanted to believe it was a hoax, but it was a very real, very tragic end to a Hollywood legend. As she once charmed audiences, one can imagine her voice echoing from the past saying, "I must say it is a pleasure to be here," a stark contrast to her silent finale. Moving on to number 8 on our tragic list, we uncover the story of Montgomery Clift, a man whose breathtaking beauty was literally shattered and then painstakingly reassembled. When Clift first hit Tinseltown, he wasn't just handsome. He was flawlessly, almost disturbingly perfect. With a jawline cut from marble eyes that could peer into your soul and a gentle aura, he ushered in a completely new archetype for Hollywood leading men. He wasn't the stoic cowboy or the rough and tumble soldier of the previous generation. He was soft, exposed, and deeply complicated. Standing shoulder to shoulder with titans like Marlon Brando and James Dean Clift, rewrote the rulebook on masculinity, injecting raw emotion and psychological torment into the cinematic landscape. But then fate intervened with a horrific night that would essentially cleave his existence and his visage into two distinct halves, the before and the after. It happened on May 12th, 1956, moments after he drove away from a dinner party at Elizabeth Taylor's mansion, when his car lost control and wrapped itself violently around a telephone pole. The impact was catastrophic, pulverizing his face. His nose was crushed, his jaw snapped, his sinuses fractured, and the nerves on the left side of his face were severed, causing partial paralysis. Survival meant enduring a grueling series of reconstructive surgeries just to piece his head back together, a process that was as mentally scarring as it was physical. Although the surgeons performed miracles, the man who walked out of that hospital was a stranger to the heartthrob the world had worshipped just months prior. It was eerie. The right profile remained that of the classic movie star, perfect and expressive, while the left side was stiff, sunken, and partially immobile. That exquisite symmetry was obliterated. His mouth would occasionally sag, and the golden boy look was gone forever. Yet the scars on his skin were nothing compared to the internal damage. To battle the excruciating chronic pain, Cliff dove head first into a bottle and a prescription pill jar. This toxic cocktail of booze and narcotics hit the fast-forward button on his biology, aging him at a terrifying velocity that shocked his peers. In the span of a few short years, he aged 20. By the early 1960s, despite being only in his early 40s, he looked like a walking corpse, gaunt and utterly spent. That skin, once taut and glowing, had turned yellow and hung loosely from his bones like an ill-fitting suit. Chasms of wrinkles etched themselves around his eyes and lips, and his body, formerly a vessel of athletic grace, withered away into a frail, trembling frame that moved with the stiffness of an octogenarian. By the time he shot his swan song, The Defector, in 1966, finished just weeks before he dropped dead at 45, the transformation was complete and horrifying. Watching that film, you would be hard-pressed to believe this was the same stunning youth who had seduced the camera in From Here to Eternity barely 13 years prior. On screen, he is a ghost. His cheeks, a cavernous dark rings, circle his eyes, and his complexion carries the grey tint of death. Even that commanding velvety voice had been reduced to a raspy, strained whisper that pained the ears of anyone listening. Co-stars from those twilight years spoke of the horror of witnessing a man literally disintegrate in real time right in front of them on the soundstage. Legendary director John Huston, who directed Clift in his prime and his decline, noted sadly that it felt less like working with the same man and more like directing a broken stranger. Elizabeth Taylor, his devoted friend and saviour that fateful night, famously characterised his downward spiral as the longest suicide in Hollywood history. It was a slow-motion car crash that lasted a decade, a public self-immolation that audiences watched with morbid fascination until the screen finally went black. As Clift once muttered in a moment of clarity, "I cannot answer for anyone else, but we had a meeting before," a haunting reminder of the connections lost to the tragedy. Number 9 on our list is Janet Leigh, a legend forever immortalised in a state of sheer terror. We all remember that blood-curdling shriek from Alfred Hitchcock's masterpiece, Psycho. It wasn't just a scene, it was a cultural reset, freezing that moment of vulnerability in the shower as arguably the most enduring image in cinema history. Back in her absolute heyday before the industry pressures took their toll, Leigh possessed a radiant, almost ethereal freshness that captivated audiences worldwide. She was the ultimate hybrid, effortlessly balancing the approachable sweetness of the girl next door with the untouchable high-voltage glamour of a bona fide movie star, with a face shaped like a perfect heart, eyes that seemed to sparkle with mischief, and a genuine smile that could light up a marquee. She was instant box office gold. However, as the cruel clock of Hollywood began to tick, Janet found herself battling the inevitable, making desperate choices that would eventually transform her stunning visage into a tragic cautionary tale for every ageing actress in Tinseltown. Unlike some of her contemporaries who allowed their laugh lines to tell a story of a life well lived, Leigh refused to go gently. She became a pioneer of sorts, an early adopter of invasive cosmetic procedures designed to chase the ghost of youthfulness at any cost. Starting way back in the late 1970s, a time when plastic surgery was essentially the Wild West and techniques were primitive at best, she began her journey down a very slippery slope. She subjected herself to a relentless assembly line of treatments and surgeries, unaware that these experiments would have permanent, irreversible consequences for her once flawless appearance. The tragedy here wasn't the result of a single botched job. It was a cumulative disaster, a perfect storm of obsession and poor timing. We are talking about aggressive facelifts performed with dangerous frequency fillers pumped into tissue that hadn't even healed from the last round, and experimental techniques that were far from perfected. All of this contributed to the slow, heartbreaking erasure of the natural beauty the world had fallen in love with. By the time the decadent 1980s rolled around, the whispers in the industry had turned into loud conversations. The fans couldn't help but notice that something was terribly wrong. The Janet Leigh appearing in movies and television cameos during this era looked strikingly and somewhat disturbingly different from the icon people remembered. Her skin, which used to have a soft, dewy glow, now appeared pulled unnaturally tight across her cheekbones, as if it were under constant tension. Her eyes, once the windows to a soulful performance, now seemed permanently pried open, locking her face into an inadvertent mask of perpetual shock and alarm. When she attempted to smile, the mechanics of her face failed her. Some muscles remained bizarrely paralysed, while others shifted unpredictably. Perhaps the most jarring change of all was visible in the actual texture and movement of her complexion. The natural elasticity and the subtle micro-expressions that made her acting so compelling were gone, replaced by a smooth plastic-like sheen that reflected studio lights in a harsh, unflattering way. Directors and cinematographers who worked with her during these later years frequently complained about the nightmare of trying to light her properly. The standard lighting tricks used to soften features or highlight emotions simply didn't work on a face that had lost its natural contours and ability to move. What made Lee's cosmetic transformation particularly heartbreaking was the cruel irony of it all. It seemed to visually mimic her most famous character's demise. With those widened, unblinking eyes and skin drawn tight against the skull, she began to look like a woman trapped in a never-ending state of panic. It was an eerie echo of Marion Crane's terror in that infamous motel shower, except this time the mask of fear was permanent and self-inflicted. In one of her final major public outings at the 50th anniversary screening of Psycho in 2010, the side-by-side comparison was devastating. Seeing the fresh-faced young actress on the screen juxtaposed with the woman standing on stage was a stark reminder of time's cruelty. Although she carried herself with the elegance and poise of old Hollywood royalty, her facial mobility was almost non-existent. Her emotional range was trapped behind a frozen facade. Her eyes might have been screaming with nostalgia and joy, but her face remained inextricably locked in stone. Come now, surely you have glanced at an actuarial table at some point in your life, haven't you? Number 10, the Titan of Tough, Edward G. Robinson. This is the story of what happens when the tough guy finally crumbles. Edward G. Robinson didn't just play gangsters, he built the blueprint for them. With Little Caesar, he established himself as cinema's quintessential mob boss, a role that would define his legacy forever. Despite standing only 5'5" and lacking the conventional leading man aesthetics, Robinson commanded every room he entered. He possessed an intensity that burned through the lens, a voice that demanded obedience, and a mug so distinctive you couldn't look away. In his prime, Robinson's face was literally his fortune. It was a landscape of raw power and grit. Those heavy hooded eyes, the prominent noble nose, and the determined bulldog set of his jaw told you everything you needed to know about his characters. He was never going to be the pretty boy on the magazine cover, but his face had character strength and a unique magnetism that was absolutely perfect for the gritty noir world he inhabited. However, the aging process is rarely kind, and for Robinson, it was particularly brutal, accelerated by a lifetime of hard living and personal tragedy. The man was a notorious chain smoker, rarely photographed without his trademark cigar clamped between his teeth, whether the cameras were rolling or not. Decades of inhaling toxic smoke took a severe toll on his dermis, turning his skin into a leathery, deeply creased map of his vices by the time he reached his late 50s. The constant squinting through thick clouds of cigar smoke only served to deepen the canyons around his already heavy-lidded eyes. And then, of course, there was the failing health to contend with. Robinson suffered from chronic debilitating heart conditions that necessitated a cocktail of potent medications, many of which came with nasty side effects like severe fluid retention. This caused a puffy, bloated quality to his features that became increasingly impossible to hide as he entered his golden years. By the swinging 1960s, Robinson's physical transformation was nothing short of dramatic. The face that was once chiselled from granite had become noticeably swollen and soft. His jowls hung heavy with age, and large pockets of fluid accumulated stubbornly beneath his eyes, giving him a look of perpetual exhaustion. His complexion lost its vigour, taking on an unhealthy greyish pallor, riddled with visible discoloration and liver spots. Even his formidable silhouette began to fail him. The erect chest-out posture that once made him seem 10 feet tall, despite his short stature, had collapsed, curving into a permanent defeated stoop. The final crushing blow came from the immense emotional stress of his personal life. Robinson was targeted during the witch hunts of the McCarthy era and was dragged before the House Un-American Activities Committee to testify. Although he was eventually cleared of any wrongdoing, the humiliation and anxiety of the experience took a visible physical toll that he never quite recovered from. Close friends and industry colleagues remarked that he seemed to age 10 years in the span of just a few months during that dark period of political persecution. In his final cinematic appearances, including the dystopian classic Soylent Green in 1973, the camera lens could no longer conceal the extent of his decay. The man who had once dominated the screen with ferocity and boundless energy now appeared fragile, brittle, and profoundly exhausted, a shadow of the titan he once was. The makeup team worked overtime, attempting to breathe some life back into him, but it was a losing battle. Instead of looking revitalised, he often appeared painted and waxy like a museum figure left out in the heat. But the most heartbreaking burn came from legendary director Richard Brooks, a man who had directed Robinson during his golden era and witnessed his decline firsthand. After wrapping a particularly grueling scene late in the actor's career, Brooks allegedly whispered the devastating critique, "The face that once launched 1,000 gangsters has finally run aground." By the time the curtain was falling, Hollywood had effectively ghosted him, and even those signature tough guy mobster roles simply stopped coming his way. You know, honestly, I would just snatch that part right out, swap it for something better. Exactly. Sometimes I would sprinkle in a little extra spice just knowing the suits would cut it later. Moving on to number 11, let's talk about Mae West, the woman who filed a restraining order against Father Time. Back in the day, Mae West didn't just push the envelope, she shredded it, building an empire on dangerous curves, unapologetic sexuality, and the kind of spicy one-liners that made censors sweat. Throughout the 1930s, she wasn't just a star. She was a walking scandal and a box office goldmine with her platinum halo of curls, sleepy bedroom eyes, and that signature pout, creating a brand that was instantly iconic. But here is the thing, while most silver screen goddesses eventually make peace with gravity and the calendar, Mae West took a truly radical stance and decided she simply would not participate in reality. It didn't matter if she was sliding into her 60s, 70s, or even her 80s. West committed to the bit with terrifying dedication, maintaining the exact same aesthetic she had invented in the 1930s. The platinum wigs, the troweled on paint, the scandalous gowns, and the man-eater persona, everything remained frozen in amber. However, as the decades rolled on, this refusal to evolve started drifting into the Twilight Zone, taking on a bizarre and surreal quality. By the time she showed up in Myra Breckinridge in 1970 at age 77 and the infamous Sextet in 1978 at 85, the gap between her actual age and her presentation was frankly hallucinatory. Her hair wasn't just hair anymore. It was a stiff architectural wig styled exactly like it was 40 years prior, and the makeup became a heavy mask. We are talking thick industrial layers of foundation, aggressive eyeliner, and bright red lipstick drawn way outside the lines in a desperate attempt to create fuller lips that just weren't there. But the most mind-bending part was her absolute insistence on playing the same irresistible sex bomb she had been half a century earlier. In the movie Sextet, to put it bluntly, the visual effect was deeply unsettling. Under those unforgiving, high-wattage studio lights, that thick shell of makeup would dry out and crack, settling into deep wrinkles and creating a bizarre mask-like visage that looked ready to shatter. Her physical movements, which used to be liquid sin and suggestion, had turned rigid and fragile. That famous hip-swaying strut that drove men wild had tragically morphed into a tentative, fearful shuffle, even though she was clearly trying her hardest to sell it as a sexy saunter. The behind-the-scenes reality was even sadder. According to the cast and crew of Sextet, West's eyesight had deteriorated to the point where she was legally blind and couldn't even read the script in front of her face. She had to have her lines fed to her through a concealed earpiece, which led to these bizarre, disconnected pauses and a delivery that felt like she was broadcasting from another planet. Filming became a nightmare, with scenes chopped into tiny fragments because she physically couldn't handle standing for long takes. The stark, painful contrast between the fantasy image West was clinging to and the undeniable reality of her octogenarian body created a spectacle that audiences found excruciating to witness. The critics, they didn't hold back. They were absolutely savage. One reviewer ruthlessly described her final screen appearance as the cinematic equivalent of watching your own grandmother try to perform a striptease, awkward, inappropriate, and something you can never unsee. Yet Mae West remained stubbornly defiant until her dying breath, insisting in every interview that she felt just as spicy and desirable as ever. When pressed about the concept of aging, she famously shot back, "I never worried about age. I don't feel like I will ever be an old woman. I will always be a young woman who just happens to have aged." But the camera is a cruel truth teller. Despite the army of handlers, the expensive wigs, the plaster of makeup, and the strategically placed soft lighting time remained undefeated. What ended up on screen wasn't the young Mae West, nor was it a graceful, dignified elder stateswoman, but something else entirely. It was a strange theatrical ghost of youth that actually highlighted her age far more than if she had just owned it. She didn't just age, she denied it entirely, and sadly the denial was the only thing everyone could see.